Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis. This presentation this week is on turning the tide to victory in World War II. And particularly, I'm going to look at the Pacific theater and then look at the Pacific theater and then look at the European theater and how the tide turns in the European theater. And we will consider the conclusion and the end of the war in both theaters.
So, this map, I wanted to just show you this map to give you a look at and an idea of the many different empires that were involved in this area of the world at the outset of the war. Scholars today are generally in agreement on one basic issue when it comes to World War II in the Pacific, and that is that the war was largely the long term consequence of a collision of empires. The United States, after expanding with manifest destiny across its continent, the United States, after the Civil War particularly, began an expansion into the Pacific, establishing territories in Hawaii, in Guam, ultimately, um, in other Pacific islands that you can see here. As the United States pushed across the Pacific, of course, other European powers had colonized other parts of Asia. Many of these colonizations occurred the um, in the 1800s, and of course, the United States most notably took the Philippines from the Spanish, and the Spanish had colonized the Philippines in the 1500s. But you can see the French, of course, in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, the British in the yellow, the Dutch in the orange, and of course the Japanese in the red. The Japanese, in particular, being really modeled after the example of Western European and American colonialism and imperialism, Japan sought to become a great empire. Japan's motivations were directly linked to the um, the examples that were set by all of the other European powers that were colonizing this part of the world. And so Japan sought to become a great world power, just as during the Spanish American War, when Teddy Roosevelt largely um, helped to lead the United States into war with Spain. Teddy Roosevelt viewed the United States as needing to become a great world power, and to do this meant to take colonies. And Japan understood the same thing. And so Japan had for some time expanded into the islands of the Pacific, establishing its own empire. And of course, when World War II began, it was really a strategic decision on the part of Japan when the attack on Pearl Harbor came to beat the United States quickly rather than to allow this collision of empires to result in a war that the United States could be more prepared for, if you will. Um, so Japan's attempt to become a great empire in the Pacific, as you can see on the map, necessarily comes at the consequence of a number of different imperial territories: the British, the French, and the Americans, of course. And after Pearl Harbor, of course, the Philippines were the first place the Japanese went, defeating the forces of MacArthur rather easily, as Douglas MacArthur was caught unprepared. Why do the Japanese want an empire? Well, of course, they want to be a great power. They want to be a great world power of naval strength and economic strength in the region. Japan's a modernizing country, just like other countries in the world, but one thing that makes Japan very unique, especially when you compare it to the United States, is that Japan needs resources. They lack fossil fuels. And so their push into the areas of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines and Southeast Asia, this was driven largely out of a desire for resources and the establishment of a strategic empire. Of course, Pearl Harbor, this is the USS Arizona sinking. It would be Pearl Harbor that led the United States to officially declare war on Japan, which we, of course, we had cut off trade to them at this point. The Japanese believed that they were expanding. And this is one thing that Admiral Yamamoto, who led the carrier task force that attacked Pearl Harbor, one thing that they understood was that Japan was expanding as an empire, and that the expansion of their empire was necessarily going to create war with the United States because of areas like the Philippines, and of areas of other allies like the British in in the French in Indochina and Southeast Asia, and of course all the way down into Indonesia. The Japanese knew it was going to create war with the United States, and so they believed that they were better off to try and take out the United States' Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack. The idea was that if you could attack the United States and knock out the Pacific Fleet, the Japanese rationalized that they would be able to entrench themselves in their Pacific Empire to such that the United States would not be able to turn and make war at a speed with which they could really, undermine the Japanese after they had entrenched their empire. But of course, the United States, the carriers were out of port at that time. The Japanese missed the aircraft carriers. World War II was a war of aircraft carriers in the Pacific to a large degree, of course. But also, the United States, the Japanese really underestimated the United States' ability to mobilize for the war and to retool. And they did so much, much more quickly than the Japanese could have expected. And the result was that by the end of May 1942, after the Battle of Midway, the United States had really stopped the offensive tide of the Japanese Empire and was beginning in subsequent battles at places like the Battle of Coral Sea. The United States, with the Battle of Midway, was beginning to turn the war against Japan. In some respects, by the end of 1942, the Japanese were beginning a slow kind of defeat in a war of attrition against the United States. So this attack happened on Sunday morning, December 7th. There were 3 sorties, and of course, the United States was caught by surprise. The Japanese hoped for a quick win in the Pacific. They thought that was their only chance, was a quick win. Of course, famously, FDR, labels this a day that would live in infamy, and declares war on Japan. And of course, after that, the Nazis, Hitler, declared war on the United States, which led to a prompt declaration from the United States on Germany.
After the United States was attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the next target for the Japanese empire was the Philippines. The goal of the Japanese, they had seen the United States was the primary imperial competitor to the Japanese, especially since European powers were embroiled in the European War. France had been defeated. The United States was the primary impediment to the consolidation of the Japanese empire in South Asia and in the Pacific. And so they turned immediately to the Philippines, where the Philippines was an American colony, and where the United States had significant military installations. They would take out the Philippines, and then they would head south towards Indonesia for the oil reserves, and Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia. The United States suffered a crushing defeat in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, who is probably the most famous general from the time period, was ill-prepared for the attack. The Americans were caught with their planes sitting on the runway, completely unprepared for an attack. We had our entire fleet of planes, in one case, destroyed by the Japanese, who simply found the planes to be sitting ducks, completely unprepared to take off. Following the defeat in the Philippines, the Japanese committed what's considered one of the first of the major war crimes of World War II. Obviously outside of what it did in China in 1937. But the Americans suffered at the hands of the Japanese in what was known as the Bataan Death March. And this map here shows you the course of the march. So 600 U.S. soldiers, as well as several thousand Filipinos, were forced to march over 60 miles north to the railhead at San Fernando, where they would then take a train to a prisoner of war camp. The Japanese, from their perspective of honor in warfare, had very little kind of respect for those who had surrendered in warfare, and treated the Americans very poorly. And this went down as one of the earliest war crimes of the conflict. And the Japanese will be the Japanese leaders associated with this will be convicted of war crimes following the war. Here's a picture of some of the dead American soldiers in the Bataan Death March. Soldiers were incredibly, when they were surrendered, many of these soldiers were living on 1,000 calories a day. So their health was not great. Many had been wounded. It's a very formidable climate, and many of the dead just simply dropped by the trail side for lack of water and basic necessities. Some of them were clubbed and beaten or shot by their captors.
In the Pacific, whereas in the European theater, your main kind of characters in terms of leaders are, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's Supreme Allied Commander, of course Patton, General Montgomery for the British. But in the Pacific theater for the United States, your main personalities are Admiral Chester Nimitz and Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, shown with the corncob pipe in his mouth. Douglas MacArthur was probably the most flamboyant of American generals. He liked the spotlight, and he kind of was your stereotypical, I guess, rock star general. He was a bit of a showboater, and he liked the spotlight. Let's say that. He was very instrumental in jungle fighting in New Guinea and the Philippines. He was on the Philippines when the Japanese attacked. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they immediately turned, and within a day and a half, they were attacking the Philippines. I think it was 19 hours, to be honest with you, but they immediately turned and attacked the Philippines. And MacArthur was caught by surprise, and of course, he fled the island, and what was left of his troops, unfortunately, surrendered, and many of which were forced onto the infamous Bataan Death March. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in the painting below, was also famous for creating the strategy of island hopping. Island hopping means that you have to unseat the Japanese who were on many islands. And the only way you could really do this was because you couldn't hit every single island. It would be impossible. And so they had to pick and choose the most significant places to fight. And it became known as island hopping. And so you would hit the islands probably that had the most troops, or had the best ports, or had good runways for bringing supplies. And so you had to hit the most important islands. And the Pacific Theater is a largely amphibious type of war, and a jungle war. It's very different than the European theater. This map, if you want to go back and look more closely at it, this is a map of the many battles and operations fought in the Pacific Theater. It's not all of them, but it's a lot of them. Fighting in the Pacific, and here's another one of these pro-war advertisements. You can see that, just from that, you can see the kind of racism that is inherent in how we characterize our enemy. The Pacific Theater was brutal. It was, to a large degree, a race war. Both sides effectively viewed themselves as the highest level of civilization. The Japanese often refused to surrender, and oftentimes Americans refused to take prisoners. The death toll in the Pacific Theater was 10-1 Japanese to American casualty rates. Many theaters became associated with the Japanese fighters using cave systems as a way of entrenching in the island and being incredibly difficult to defeat. And they oftentimes would not surrender. So you saw a very brutal theater with flamethrowers and amphibious landings, and by the end of the war, the latter stages of the war, even many cases of kamikaze pilots. Some kamikaze pilots, by the way, were forced to do it. Some were strapped into their planes. Some kamikazes were actually liberal arts students like me. Well, I'm not a student, of course, like you guys. You guys are students. But I was a liberal arts student, historian, obviously. But some of these types of people were actually conscripted to be kamikazes against their will in some cases. So you see particularly a very violent end to this war in in a theater that has tremendous casualties as a result. The United States' war in Asia was throughout aided by Asian allies. Pictured here in military attire is Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the Nationalist Party in China. He fought against the forces of Mao Zedong before, during, and after World War II, the communist forces of Mao Zedong. Chiang Kai-shek ultimately is defeated, of course, by the Chinese in 1949, by the Maoist Chinese, and pushed off to the island of Taiwan. Interestingly, the United States recognized the island of Taiwan as the legitimate government of China until the 1970s. And of course, today, the United States recognizes Taiwan as an independent state, and this is disputed, of course, by the Chinese communists. But Chiang Kai-shek aided the United States in the war against the Japanese in China, and Chiang Kai-shek had been fighting, as I said, for some time against the communist forces of Mao Zedong in his attempt to unify the country. And of course, he was a strong American ally during the war. Ho Chi Minh, pictured here. Ho Chi Minh was the Vietnamese nationalist leader who fought the French, and fought the French in a way as an anti-colonial nationalist before the war, and then fought the French quite literally after the war. And he also fought the Japanese in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, of course, if anybody knows anything about the history of the Vietnam War, this will probably come to some surprise. Ho Chi Minh was, during World War II, an ally of the United States, and he was used in fighting the Japanese and helping the Americans with downed pilots in the region. We provided Ho Chi Minh with radio equipment, small arms. We treated him medically for dysentery and saved his life at one time when the OSS, which OSS means Office of Strategic Services, it's a precursor to the CIA during World War II. But the OSS Deer Mission, as it was called, had famously parachuted in, met with Ho Chi Minh, treated him for dysentery. We helped to train some of the first 250 to 300 Viet Minh guerrilla fighters. In the French Indochina War after World War II, they were called the Viet Minh. Later, we will call them the Viet Cong. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but as members of the OSS would testify to after the fact, he was a nationalist first and a communist second. And what that means really is that Ho Chi Minh, what he was most interested in was ending colonialism and ending Western influence, Western-led influence in his country, and creating an independent nation for the Vietnamese people. That was his primary motive. And he thought communism would be probably the best thing for his country. Ho Chi Minh was never, he never fought what becomes what known as the Vietnam War out of an interest of leading a global conquest of communism. Ho Chi Minh is motivated by creating an independent nation for his people, and he appealed quite directly and consistently to the United States. He wrote letters to Harry Truman. Harry Truman never read these letters because he had bigger fish to fry, so to speak. He had bigger concerns and really didn't have a policy on Vietnam. When Ho Chi Minh, at the end of the war, when Ho Chi Minh declared independence in 1945 after the Vietnamese had been defeated, Ho Chi Minh actually directly quoted the United States Declaration of Independence and had the band play the Star Spangled Banner. And actually, the Vietnamese people who were there actually tell a story of when a OSS plane did an overflight of the crowd, which was several 100,000 that gathered in Hanoi to listen to Ho Chi Minh, and everybody thought it was the French coming to strafe them, and it was an OSS plane, and everybody rose their hands and cheered. So a very interesting thing that America, the United States, perhaps at one time had a chance to be an ally with Ho Chi Minh, and we were an ally with Ho Chi Minh during World War II in the fight against the Japanese. Of course, and this is just to make a long story short, but what ultimately happens is the United States will choose to back the French in the French Indochina War rather than Ho Chi Minh. And the reason for this And this is in the 40s. The French Indochina War began in 1946, and it was an attempt by the French to recolonize Vietnam. And the reason the United States chooses to side with the French largely is because of a concern with communism in the 40s, but particularly a concern with communism at that time in Europe. We were deeply afraid of communism sweeping across Western Europe, and France had communists in political parties, and we were very afraid that a weakening of the economy and the political will in France could result in France and other Western countries falling to communism. And that was something in the 40s that we could not accept. And so the United States ultimately supports the French. And then, of course, over time, by the late 40s and the early 50s, as you have the Korean War and China falling to communism, the United States increasingly interprets Vietnam in the sense of kind of a global containment policy, containment of communism. And this is when the United States really begins its war against Ho Chi Minh. But during World War II, they were allies of convenience, if you will. So in June of 1942, barely 6 months since the Pearl Harbor attack, or just over 6 months, the United States turned the tide in the Pacific at the Battle of Midway. And this was June 3rd through 6th, 1942. And the reason that it really turned the tide was because the American naval force, which had been intercepting and interpreting the Japanese radio codes, were able to effectively catch the Japanese carriers off guard. We sank 3 of Japan's most important carriers, and you can see them in the image here, smoking from below. And these are, of course, carrier aircraft planes that you're looking at. The wings fold, and they flew from other American planes. This was a carrier battle. It was kind of symptomatic of a new age in naval warfare. Wars had historically been determined, at sea by ships of the line, gunships, battleships in the 20th century. But World War II became largely a war of the aircraft carrier. And when we sunk the 3 most significant of the Japanese aircraft carriers like the Soryu, the Akagi, for example, it really stopped Japan's offensive push. Most historians consider it the turning point of the war in the Pacific, the point at which Japan's offensive capabilities were no longer present, and the United States slowly began to win a war of attrition against the Japanese. So it was a turning point, a very significant moment in the war, and primarily because of the Japanese suffering such heavy losses to their aircraft carriers.
So the United States really stopped the offensive push of the Japanese in battles like Midway in June of 1942, only really 7 months after Pearl Harbor, and of course the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942 as well. These battles had really been critical to stopping the offensive push of the Japanese. And at the Battle of Guadalcanal, which runs from August 1942 to February 1943, this battle becomes the battle where the Japanese are for the first time really put on the defensive. The Japanese, remember, they lack the resources of the United States. They lack the kind of numbers of the United States. And so the Japanese in the Pacific are early on very much looking for a decisive battle that would allow them to kind of take out a major chunk of the American fleet and thereby allow them to consolidate their empire in such a way that would be, impossible for the United States to kind of uproot them, which itself was a very big gamble, of course, and a great underestimation of the mobilization capabilities of the United States. Guadalcanal becomes significant, one, of course, because it puts Japan on the defensive for the first time, and also because the Japanese, in seeking this big climactic decisive victory, wound up sacrificing into this into this conflict down near the Solomon Islands in almost like a battle of attrition. And the United States is always going to win a battle of attrition. And so the Japanese really overcommit really into this, and it cost them a lot in terms of pilots and in terms of initiative. The goal of the battle is a small island located, down by the Solomon Islands. It's a small island. It's about 90 miles long. It's about 50 miles wide. Of course, it's a wooded island, and it's a hot tropical climate. The United States landed on the island and sought to secure control of what's known as what they called Henderson Field, as you see depicted on this map. Over the course of the battle, the Japanese would, seek to destroy the American fleet that was aiding the soldiers on land and to defeat the American soldiers seeking to take the airstrip. It was a massive battle. It was a massive naval battle and a massive land battle. The first Marines were actually taken out of action for an entire year after this, as they had to basically reconsolidate, retool, and reman and retrain because of the tremendous casualties taken here. Guadalcanal experienced some of the closest fighting of the war. In some cases, effectively hand-to-hand combat in some cases. It was a conflict, it was a battle that was associated, like the rest of the Pacific Theater, with a tremendous sort of relative amount of dead in the area of the battlefield. The Pacific battles, particularly the island-hopping campaigns, were fought in such small territories that they were often associated with a tremendous kind of density of dead. And Guadalcanal certainly exhibited this. It was one of the first battles where Americans experienced Japanese banzai assaults, suicide assaults. The Japanese were forced onto death marches in retreat in this desperate battle of attrition. Ultimately, it was a mistake. The Japanese overcommitted here, seeking to win a decisive naval battle outside of Guadalcanal, and what ultimately happened is they were drawn into a battle of attrition. And the result there was that the Americans ultimately wore them out. They had to pull back, and they lost many, many experienced pilots. The Japanese advantage early on was really in their experience and their training and their passion as fighters. And when they start to lose many of their best trained pilots, it becomes a huge problem for them. They're really unable to retrain and re-equip their Air Force after losing so many experienced pilots. So this is the beginning, really, of the defensive for the Japanese. I just want to show you a few images from Guadalcanal. These are American soldiers, and you can note the environment. Pacific fighting is often in obviously tropical climates, often in wooded, jungled climates, though not always. Here you see dead soldiers at Guadalcanal. These are dead Japanese soldiers. The Pacific Theater was particularly brutal, and there was a really high density of death. And usually it was such that the fallen enemy combatants were rarely given what you might see as like traditional sort of burials of any kind, but were rather simply bulldozed to the side out of more of a cleanup operation than a burial. It's just kind of the nature of this theater of war. Here you see the USS Enterprise under attack. This is the American aircraft carrier. At the beginning of the war, we had 4 major aircraft carriers. The Lexington, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet were our primary aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The Lexington was sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. Yorktown was almost sunk, but returned to action at Midway, of course, where it would be ultimately sunk, but played an integral role nonetheless. The Pacific strategy after Guadalcanal really centered around 2 major thrusts: the strategy by the United States of how to defeat the Japanese, and Admiral Nimitz was primarily associated with the notion of island hopping, which was the idea that you would take a series of smaller islands in the Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Marianas, and used these smaller islands to sort of strangle the rest of the Japanese empire and cut off trade. That was called island hopping. General MacArthur's idea was to wage primarily land battles on the big islands, so to come up from the Solomons, to take Rabaul in the north of New Britain near Papua New Guinea, to go up through Papua New Guinea, and then ultimately the Philippines. And his idea was that if you did this, you would create like a fortified defensive wall that would effectively prevent the Japanese from being able to get oil and rubber resources into the home islands. So cutting them off. These are both kind of the strategy of cutting them off, but MacArthur's was more of a land-based strategy than was Nimitz, which was largely amphibious and centered around taking smaller islands. MacArthur's undoubtedly would have cost, it did cost more lives than Nimitz's strategy. The U.S. really didn't make a decision. They told both to go ahead with their plans, and so the United States sort of chooses both routes simultaneously. And here you see, in the map below, you see these two primary thrusts carried out by the United States in the Pacific. The green to the north is Nimitz's island hopping strategy. The green to the south is MacArthur's strategy. And New Britain, if you're wondering, if you look at where New Guinea is, and you see that island just out to the southeast, the sort of long kind of sickle-shaped island, that is the island of New Britain, and that is where Rabaul was, which was critical to MacArthur's strategy. And of course on there you can see Guadalcanal, which we just talked about, near the Solomon Islands. So ultimately you have these two sort of assaults that ultimately lead to the Philippines. The Navy actually under Admiral Nimitz had actually wanted to go straight into the Ryukyu Islands of Okinawa, which are the islands just to the south of Japan, those little small islands to the south of Japan and north of Taiwan. And of course we will ultimately go there and fight battles like Okinawa and further to the east, of course, or the west, east, I'm sorry, Iwo Jima, of course. But before we did that, we fought with, we being the Navy. I'm not in the Navy or the U.S. Marines. No, or the Army, for that matter. No, the United States ultimately made the decision to combine the Navy of Nimitz and the Marines with the Army of MacArthur, not McCarthy, in fighting in the Philippines. And so they kind of met in the Philippines, and they retook the Philippines beginning really in October 1944 in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and then moved up to places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima. The island hopping campaign began in the Gilbert Islands with the Battle of Tarawa. And Tarawa was a very small island. It was like 4 mile. It was like a 4 mile long island. Tarawa becomes associated with some incredibly tenacious fighting by the Japanese. The Japanese garrison at Tarawa of 4,200. Guess how many came out and surrendered ultimately? 17. The Japanese fought to the death at Tarawa, and the result was the most high density amount of like corpses of dead in any other part of World War II was in the Battle of Tarawa. They went to the Marshall Islands and fought very difficult battles on islands like Kwajalein, and then in the Marianas you have at Saipan one of the most intense conflicts of the war, in which a Japanese garrison of almost 32,000, almost the entire garrison was killed. And we see in Saipan, in the Marianas, you see banzai charges, you see civilians committing suicide at the encouragement of the Japanese military rather than to surrender to the Americans. The move into the Mariana Islands really opened up the home islands to bombing, and then eventually you'll see, of course, with the attacks in Okinawa, you'll see the United States actually seize a major island very, very close to the home island of Japan, though that doesn't occur until 1945. The Mariana Islands is also associated with the larger carrier battle ever. This was the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This battle is sometimes referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because the United States scored so many kills in the air against the now inexperienced Japanese pilots. This was the cost of battles like Guadalcanal for the Japanese. They could not replace those their pilots, their airmen, and this really was of devastating consequence to the Japanese. In the Philippines, MacArthur's land operations began first down in New Britain, north of Papua New Guinea. They took Rabaul. The environment that they're fighting in is very difficult. It's a jungle environment, streams, thick brush many times, hot, and this made it very difficult. And actually, the original operation to take Rabaul and to cut off the Japanese forces there actually took upwards of 2 months, which was longer than you would have liked. When they came to the Philippines, they landed on the small island of Leyte rather than the main island of Luzon, thinking that this might, sort of catch the Japanese by surprise. But even so, there was still a huge death toll, and the battle around Leyte turned into one of the most major naval battles of the war, the so-called Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was in October of 1944. The Japanese sought to, in a way similar to how the United States, or the Japanese, I'm sorry, how the Germans tried to attack the United States and the Allies in the Battle of the Bulge. The Japanese, depicted in the red lines here on the map, sought to move in with two pincers sort of around the American fleet that was supplying the soldiers fighting on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. And in the operation, there were all kinds of efforts to outsmart, to trick the opposing side. At one point, the Japanese retreated and then came back, surprising the American fleet. But ultimately, you see the end, really, of the Japanese Navy in any significant sense in this battle. The Americans, while it is a hard-fought, tenacious battle, similar to the German attack at the Battle of the Bulge on land in Europe, in Belgium, it was a last-ditch effort, really, to stop the American offensive there that ultimately failed. It really marked the end, in a meaningful sense, of the Japanese and, of course, in Europe, the German capabilities to stop the offensive that was now inevitably going to lead to defeat. The Japanese, feeling desperation, even used kamikaze fighters in this battle, airmen that really lacked much training, but would launch suicide attacks to fly their planes into the American ships. This right here, now go and talk about the turning. I want to talk briefly about the turning point in Europe real quick, because we can't forget about what happens in the European theater. The Germans, of course, built something called the Atlantic Wall, and this map makes it look like there was actually a true wall in these areas. In reality, the Atlantic Wall was a string of defensive fortifications that the Nazis built, particularly in places like the northern coast of Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, to prevent or to defend against the inevitable oncoming Allied invasion we call DDay. The Atlantic Wall, I've been to the Atlantic Wall in Belgium. If you ever want to go to the Atlantic Wall near the border with France in Belgium. It's not far from Dunkirk, actually. And it is the most well-preserved portion of the Atlantic Wall, and you can tour it, and it's quite incredible. It was an elaborate installation of fortification, bunkers, machine gun turrets, anti-aircraft and flak guns, pillboxes, concrete bunkers, all along this area, also built in the Channel Islands between Great Britain and Europe to defend against the D-Day invasion that was going to come, of course, ultimately on June 6, 1944. The Atlantic Wall was overseen by, ultimately, around the time of D-Day, by Erwin Rommel. And Erwin Rommel tried to advise Hitler to maintain the force strength as it had been laid out, But Hitler would be tricked by the Allies into moving his forces, at least parts of them, up near the narrowest point between Great Britain and Europe, which was the area of the Pas-de-Calais. He thought that that would be the area that the Allies would attack. And it was largely through misinformation that he thought that. And it was ultimately a very, very disastrous mistake, potentially, for Germany. Here you see Operation Overlord. You see on June 6, 1944, you see the American soldiers, Allied soldiers, I should say, deploying on the beaches of Normandy. The D-Day operation landed at 5 different beaches on Normandy. The beaches were Gold Beach, Sword Beach, Juneau, Omaha, and Utah. And these were the landing zones for the American invasion of Europe, D-Day, Operation Overlord, which was overseen by General Eisenhower. The Allies had used various methods to try to trick the Germans into thinking that the invasion was going to occur at the Pas-de-Calais as opposed to at Normandy. They created a false army regiment, actually, inflatable tanks, tents, cardboard cutouts, the whole 9 yards over in an area near the narrowest point in the English Channel, so that when the Luftwaffe would fly over to bomb London, they would see this and they would report back that there's a buildup there. They had false intelligence documents that were leaked and designed for the Germans to intercept that suggested that. And ultimately, as I mentioned, Hitler will redeploy many of his troops from areas like Normandy up to the Pas-de-Calais, thus making Normandy more vulnerable and helping to make the D-Day operation more effective, or successful, I should say. It was, of course, effective, successful. D-Day was the largest military operation in history, as well as, obviously, the largest amphibious landing in history. And you see here soldiers leaving what were called the Higgins boats. These were these landing crafts that would be incredibly uncomfortable to be in, because they were very shallow, and so they really felt all the waves. People would get seasick in these. You can't see out the sides, and then the door drops down, and effectively you have to jump out into the water with bullets hurling at you. Here is General Dwight D. Eisenhower addressing Allied soldiers the day before D-Day on June 5th, 1944. Eisenhower planned and led the D-Day invasion from England and, of course, Great Britain. And, of course, he carried a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety over this operation because of the scale of the fortifications that he knew that Allied forces were going to go up against, of resistance that they were going to go up against in Europe when they landed. But, of course, D-Day was a success, and ultimately the Allies will begin to push the Germans back. And over the next year, they will push the Germans back into, of course, all the way into Germany, ultimately obtaining the defeat of Germany in May of 1945.
A few more slides, guys. Yalta, 1945. This is Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. When you look at their posture, I mean, obviously, there's some obvious things there. FDR and Churchill, somewhat friends, and also not in military gear. Roosevelt very much played kind of an intermediary with Stalin and Churchill. And Stalin and Churchill really didn't like each other, and Stalin and FDR didn't trust each other. At this conference, though, at Yalta in 1945, FDR sought to work with his allies. And so FDR at this conference made suggestions to Stalin, or at least Stalin took them this way, that the United States, so long as Stalin could help the United States in the war, particularly the war in Asia, FDR implied, or at least Stalin believed FDR implied, that he would overlook attempts by Stalin to occupy areas of Poland and Eastern Europe and, of course, Eastern Germany, which is what, of course, happens at the end of the war. So you see a lot of end of the war decisions being made here. FDR believed that he could negotiate and compromise with Stalin. And Stalin was a rational man, granted a very paranoid person and also a very brutal leader. But FDR believed you had to work with him, otherwise you're going to have another war, and he wanted to desperately avoid another war, especially on the end of the most devastating war in human history. Just a look at a map. This shows Germany at the final collapse, as it's being driven back by the Allies in the West, and of course the Soviets in the East. The end of the Pacific was really a war of attrition, much in the way that World War I was a war of attrition. Of course, it was a war of attrition in Europe too. It was a war of attrition, period. But Japan kind of whittled down slowly. We completely destroyed their merchant shipping with unrestricted submarine warfare. The United States did. Japan had completely run out of pilots by 1944. They really had no naval ability whatsoever outside of a few ships and some submarines. They were literally just kind of slowly being beaten to the point of unconditional surrender. In March of 1945, the United States firebombed Tokyo, which killed about 83,000. Firebombing is effectively using incendiary devices to basically light the air on fire. Very devastating kind of warfare. It was used by the British in places like Dresden, Germany, and the United States uses it against the Japanese. Okinawa, which this image that you see here was an image that I took in Okinawa. That's a pillbox or a machine gun bunker. I actually crawled down inside of it, but I didn't include that picture because I was crawling down inside the machine gun turret. But anyway, it just wasn't a very good picture. Let's just put it that way. I had a funny look on my face or something. Anyway, but Okinawa was one of the big reasons why the United States decides to drop the atomic bombs, because Okinawa was very intense fighting. There was something like 50,000 Japanese killed. People committed suicide by jumping off of cliffs. In many cases, people fought to the death. It was a gritty, grueling battle on Okinawa. Americans had to, in some cases, execute prisoners. And it encouraged the United States to use the atomic bomb to end the war. Now, the United States demanded unconditional surrender, and that demand goes back to the Atlantic Conference as well. Unconditional surrender basically meant in Europe and in the Pacific that the United States would only accept a complete surrender, basically allow them to occupy Japan and obtain the complete and total surrender of Japan. And that meant that you're going to have to find a way to fight on mainland Japan or get another method for obtaining the surrender from the Japanese. The Japanese had offered conditional surrenders at this time. Particularly, they wanted to leave the emperor in place and avoid the occupation of the home islands. But they had offered, prior to the bombing, the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb, they had offered very, very reasonable in terms of the United States perspective, conditional surrender options. But the United States felt that it had to go through with its demand of unconditional surrender. This is a look inside one of the tunnels in Okinawa. The Admiralty were down in these coral caves that they created. Ultimately, they committed suicide there. And when you go to Okinawa, you can tour these caves, and it's pretty fascinating. This is an image of Tokyo after the 1945 firebombing. Devastated, 83,000 people. Most of the buildings were wood, and so they burned, and it was very awful. And there's horror stories of people who survived by getting in the water, as you see there, and breathing through straws and things like that as the place was engulfed with flames. Of course, the Manhattan Project, the U.S. atomic weapons project that resulted in the successful usage of 3 bombs during World War II. Obviously, the first bomb was detonated as a test in the New Mexico desert and White Sands in July of 1945, and this was called the Trinity test. The atomic bomb became really the reason or became the way that the United States hoped that it could achieve its goal of unconditional surrender. The United States sought a total surrender of Japan and an occupation of the home islands. And so it was a decision for the United States really between invading the home islands or ultimately using the atomic bombs. Harry Truman did not even know about the atomic bombs when he became president. Here you see pictured Little Boy, which is the second atomic bomb ever detonated. The first, of course, detonated in combat over Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. There were 3 locations used in the creation of these bombs: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and of course nearby Hanford, Washington. We built both a plutonium bomb and also a hydrogen bomb. A plutonium bomb and also a uranium bomb. The hydrogen bomb, guys, was not actually completed until and tested until 5 years later. So we create a plutonium bomb and a uranium bomb. They both looked rather different in nature, and of course they are unique in the level of devastation that they can bring. This is the plane, the B-29, the B-29 that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. The first bomb dropped in combat. It was piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, and of course this is a B-29, and it flew ultimately from the island of Tinian-Delahey and ultimately over Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. So only 3 days after the Hiroshima bombing, and of course Hiroshima was a devastating bombing. As you see the statistics there, Hiroshima bombed flattened 4 square miles. 100,000 people died in a relatively short time frame. 3 days afterwards, they dropped another bomb on August 9th, 1945, on Nagasaki. So Hiroshima was dropped on August 6th, and of course Nagasaki on August 9th. One of the great questions that historians have had to struggle with and deal with is the question of, was the usage of the atomic bomb necessary? The United States had a position of unconditional surrender. This was a policy that we established with both Germany and Japan at the Atlantic Conference in 1942. And the unconditional surrender suggested that the United States would only accept absolute total surrender of the Axis powers and the occupation of their lands. Some have questioned whether or not unconditional surrender was necessary, because oftentimes it's couched as it was either this or invading the home islands. But historians have questioned whether or not unconditional surrender was actually the right approach, or that it may have unnecessarily prolonged the war. The Japanese had, of course, made surrender offers to the United States, and before the usage of these bombs, Japan appealed to the Soviet Union as a potential intermediary in negotiations to end the war without an occupation of the home islands. So there's a lot of debate among historians whether or not the atomic bomb was the right choice. It resulted in absolutely just atrocious human devastation. 100,000 people died in Hiroshima, around 80,000 died in Nagasaki. And of course, that doesn't count for long-term issues with birth defects, leukemia, other forms of cancer, and so on. So it's a devastating thing. And of course, it unleashes on the world the technology of ultimately nuclear warfare, which perhaps that's inevitable, but nonetheless, the construction and usage of these weapons unearths this technology, and the consequences for that are obviously huge. Nuclear proliferation today remains perhaps the greatest concern in terms of global foreign policy. Now, I also say that this is often something that's difficult for Americans to think of. World War II becomes a conflict for Americans that is highly romanticized. And as a result of this, oftentimes our ability to critique it is lost. And historians, of course, will critique it quite heavily, but everyday Americans would probably not see the war in terms, for example, of the issue of race in the conflict, at least in the Pacific theater, and they would probably view the atomic bombings through a less critical lens, as though it was simply necessary and there was no other choice. And the reality was, there were other choices, and this was the choice that was made. And whether or not it was the right choice is something that really historians don't fully agree on. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I hope this helps. And I have a song here if you want to listen to one of Johnny Cash's great songs about, I suppose, one of the more unlikely American heroes during World War II. I would ask, copy and paste that to your browser and have a listen. That's a really great song. It's about a great Native American who fought at Iwo Jima, Ira Hayes, and was sort of forgotten by his country. And so there's kind of a lasting message about how the United States, in some cases, treats its people. Anyhow, I hope this is helpful, and let's have a great week.